Virginia Rose discovered her boss was a psychopath on the same day he promoted her to vice president. The congratulatory champagne in her hand turned to acid when she realized Marcus Sterling's smile never reached his eyes, and that he'd been studying her reactions like a predator sizing up prey. It started with a simple mistake in the quarterly reports that should have cost Virginia her job at Sterling Industries. She'd transposed two major client accounts, creating a discrepancy that could have resulted in a multi-million-dollar audit. But instead of firing her, Marcus had called her into his corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle, poured expensive champagne, and offered her the promotion she'd been working toward for 3 years. "Virginia, you've shown me something remarkable today," Marcus had said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "You've demonstrated that you're willing to cover up mistakes to protect the company. That's exactly the kind of loyalty I need in my inner circle." But Virginia hadn't covered up anything. She'd immediately reported the error to accounting and had been prepared to face the consequences. The mistake had been genuine, the result of working 18-hour days for 2 weeks straight while her mother was dying in hospice care. Virginia had been running on coffee and desperation, trying to balance her demanding career with watching the only person who'd ever truly loved her waste away from cancer. As Marcus continued speaking, Virginia realized with growing horror that he'd manipulated the entire situation. He'd somehow altered her reports after she'd submitted them, making it appear that she'd deliberately buried the discrepancy. Her honest mistake had been transformed into evidence of her supposed willingness to engage in corporate fraud, and now he was rewarding her for it. "I don't understand," Virginia said carefully, setting down her champagne glass with trembling fingers. "I reported that error immediately. I never tried to hide anything." Marcus's smile widened, and Virginia felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't the expression of a man who'd made a mistake. This was the look of someone who'd been caught in the act and was enjoying it. "Oh, Virginia. Sweet, honest Virginia. You're going to fit in perfectly here." He moved to his desk and pulled out a thick file with her name on it. Inside were copies of emails she'd never sent, reports with her digital signature on alterations she'd never made, and documentation of meetings she'd never attended. Someone had been building a comprehensive case against her for months, creating a paper trail that painted her as a willing participant in systematic corporate fraud. "You see, I've been watching you for quite some time," Marcus said, flipping through the manufactured evidence with obvious satisfaction. "You're smart, ambitious, and most importantly, you have something to lose. That makes you controllable, which is exactly what I need in someone who's going to help me take this company to the next level." Virginia's mind raced as she processed the implications. Marcus Sterling wasn't just her boss. He was a master manipulator who'd spent months crafting a trap specifically designed for her. Every late night at the office, every extra project she'd volunteered for, every moment she'd tried to prove herself worthy of advancement had been feeding into his psychological profile of her vulnerabilities. "What do you want from me?" Virginia asked, though she was already calculating her limited options. She could quit, but the fabricated evidence would follow her to any new job. She could report him, but who would believe her word against that of a respected CEO with a carefully constructed reputation? "I want your complete cooperation," Marcus said simply. "There are certain aspects of our business operations that require ... discretion. Nothing illegal, of course, just some creative accounting practices that help us maintain our competitive edge. You'll be overseeing those operations in your new role." Virginia understood now why her predecessor had left so suddenly, citing family obligations that everyone knew were fabricated. She understood why the turnover rate in executive positions was so high, and why Marcus Sterling had such a loyal core team who never seemed to question his decisions. They were all trapped, just like she was about to be. As she looked into Marcus's eyes, Virginia saw something that made her blood freeze. There was no warmth, no empathy, no trace of normal human emotion. Marcus Sterling wasn't just ruthless or ambitious. He was fundamentally different from other people. He was someone who could destroy lives without feeling guilt, who could manipulate and control others without experiencing remorse, who could maintain a perfect facade of charm and success while being completely hollow inside. Virginia realized she was looking at a corporate psychopath, and she was his newest victim. The promotion wasn't a reward, it was a chain, designed to keep her locked in his web of deception and control. She was trapped between compliance and destruction, with no clear path to freedom. "Congratulations, Virginia," Marcus said, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast. "Welcome to the executive team." Virginia's first week as vice president felt like being slowly poisoned. Every morning, she walked into Sterling Industries knowing she was complicit in something deeply wrong. But Marcus had made it impossible for her to extract herself without destroying her career and facing potential criminal charges for crimes she'd never committed. The creative accounting Marcus had mentioned turned out to be a sophisticated network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and manipulated contracts designed to funnel money away from employee pension funds and into executive bonuses. Virginia found herself signing documents she barely understood, approving transfers that made her stomach turn, and participating in meetings where human beings were discussed like disposable resources. "The beauty of our system," Marcus explained during one of their private briefings, "is that everyone involved believes they're just following orders. No one person has enough information to understand the full scope of what we're doing, which means no one can effectively report us even if they wanted to." Virginia realized that Marcus had been perfecting this approach for years, possibly decades. He'd built Sterling Industries into a machine designed to extract maximum profit while distributing legal liability among dozens of unwitting participants. Even the board of directors were kept in the dark about the true nature of the company's financial practices. But what disturbed Virginia more than the financial crimes was watching Marcus interact with other employees. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in psychological manipulation, finding creative ways to pit departments against each other, encouraging toxic competition that kept everyone too focused on survival to notice the larger patterns of abuse. During a staff meeting about restructuring, Virginia watched Marcus announce layoffs with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for vacation plans. 300 people would lose their jobs before Christmas, but Marcus presented it as an exciting opportunity for the remaining employees to step up and show their value to the organization. Sarah Chun, a single mother who'd worked in accounting for 8 years, broke down crying when she learned her position was being eliminated. Instead of showing even basic human compassion, Marcus used her emotional response as a teaching moment for the remaining staff. "This is exactly the kind of attitude we need to eliminate," Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough concern to sound reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Sarah's reaction shows she's more focused on her own needs than the company's success. That's the mentality that's been holding us back. Virginia felt sick watching Sarah leave the conference room, her career destroyed by a man who genuinely seemed to enjoy the process. But what made it worse was seeing how other employees nodded along with Marcus's explanation, already too afraid and conditioned to question his logic. That evening, Virginia decided to document everything she was witnessing. If she was going to be trapped in this nightmare, at least she could gather evidence that might eventually be used to stop Marcus and his network of corporate psychopaths. She started a private encrypted file on her personal laptop, cataloging every illegal transaction, every manipulative meeting, and every instance of psychological abuse she observed. But Marcus was always one step ahead. The next morning, Virginia arrived at her office to find a new security system had been installed overnight. Her computer access had been restricted, her email was being monitored, and a new administrative assistant named David had been assigned to help her with her daily tasks. David was polite, efficient, and obviously reporting her every move back to Marcus. "I hope you don't mind the additional support," Marcus said when Virginia asked about the new arrangements. "With your increased responsibilities, I want to make sure you have all the resources you need to succeed." The message was clear. Virginia was now under constant surveillance. Any attempt to document Marcus's crimes or contact outside authorities would be detected and dealt with immediately. She was trapped not just legally and financially, but physically monitored within the corporate structure Marcus controlled. During lunch, Virginia tried calling her friend Rachel, a journalist who'd helped expose corporate corruption in the past. But when she dialed Rachel's number, she heard a recording stating the line had been disconnected. A quick internet search revealed that Rachel had lost her job at the newspaper following an ethics investigation and had apparently left the city entirely. Virginia realized with growing horror that Marcus's influence extended far beyond Sterling Industries. He had connections throughout the business community, the media, and possibly law enforcement that allowed him to destroy anyone who posed a threat to his operations. Her friend hadn't just been fired, she'd been systematically erased from her professional life. That night, Virginia lay in bed calculating her options and finding them all blocked. She couldn't quit without facing criminal charges. She couldn't report Marcus without solid evidence she couldn't safely gather. She couldn't reach out for help without putting other people at risk. And she couldn't continue participating in the destruction of innocent lives without losing whatever remained of her own soul. But as she stared at the ceiling, Virginia remembered something her dying mother had told her during their last conversation. Sometimes the only way to defeat a monster is to become something they never expected you to be. Her mother had been talking about fighting cancer, but the principle applied equally to fighting psychopaths. Marcus Sterling had chosen Virginia because he thought she was controllable, predictable, and ultimately weak. He'd studied her psychology and crafted the perfect trap based on his understanding of her character. But what if he was wrong about who she really was? What if the grief, desperation, and fear he'd used to manipulate her could be transformed into something he couldn't control? Virginia Rose had spent her entire life trying to be good, honest, and ethical. But goodness hadn't protected her from Marcus's manipulation. Honesty had been used against her, and ethics were being perverted to serve evil purposes. Maybe it was time to stop being the person Marcus expected her to be and start becoming someone who could actually fight back. Virginia's transformation from victim to strategic opponent began with a single realization. Marcus Sterling's greatest weakness was his arrogance. He was so convinced of his own superior intelligence that he'd never considered Virginia might be capable of outmaneuvering him, and that blindness would become his downfall. She started small, using her new executive access to create her own network of information gathering. During routine meetings with department heads, Virginia began asking seemingly innocent questions about employee morale, financial procedures, and operational challenges. She framed her inquiries as efforts to improve efficiency, but she was actually mapping the full extent of Marcus's corruption and identifying potential allies. What Virginia discovered was worse than she'd initially imagined. Sterling Industries wasn't just engaged in financial fraud, it was a testing ground for systematic psychological manipulation, techniques that Marcus was selling to other corporations through a consulting firm he secretly owned. Companies across the country were paying him millions to learn how to exploit their employees' psychological vulnerabilities for maximum profit extraction. The employee manual Virginia found hidden in Marcus's files read like a handbook for corporate psychopaths. It detailed methods for identifying and isolating potential whistleblowers, techniques for creating toxic work environments that prevented collective action, and strategies for making employees complicit in their own exploitation. Marcus wasn't just destroying lives at Sterling Industries. He was teaching other predators how to replicate his methods nationwide. But Virginia also discovered something Marcus hadn't anticipated. Several other executives were beginning to question his methods. Tom Rodriguez in legal had been quietly documenting policy violations. Helen Park in HR had been keeping detailed records of employee complaints, and even David, her supposed spy, had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with his surveillance assignments. Virginia realized she could turn Marcus's own tactics against him by building a coalition of people who were already doubting his leadership. Instead of trying to expose him through external channels he controlled, she could work to undermine his authority from within the organization itself. Her opportunity came during the quarterly board meeting, where Marcus was scheduled to present the company's record-breaking financial performance. Virginia had spent weeks analyzing the real numbers, and she knew the profits Marcus was celebrating had come directly from stolen pension funds and fraudulent contracts. More importantly, she'd figured out how to prove it using only information the board already had access to. "Before we celebrate these numbers," Virginia said during Marcus's presentation, "I think we should discuss some concerning discrepancies I've noticed in our accounting practices." She'd prepared her statement carefully, framing her concerns as questions rather than accusations, making it difficult for Marcus to dismiss her without appearing defensive. Marcus's expression remained perfectly composed, but Virginia caught the flash of surprise and calculation in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to challenge him publicly, and he was rapidly trying to determine how much she actually knew and how dangerous she'd become. "Virginia raises an excellent point," Marcus said smoothly. "Transparency is crucial in maintaining investor confidence. Perhaps we should schedule a separate meeting to review any concerns in detail." But Virginia had anticipated his attempt to control the conversation. "Actually, I think the board deserves to see this information immediately, especially the documentation showing how our pension fund contributions have been redirected through subsidiary companies that don't appear on our organizational charts." The room fell silent. Virginia had just accused the CEO of pension fund theft in front of the entire board of directors, using language specific enough to show she had real evidence but vague enough to avoid immediate legal consequences. Marcus could no longer dismiss her concerns without addressing the substance of her allegations. Board Chairman Robert Hayes, a man in his 70s who'd founded Sterling Industries with his own father, looked genuinely shocked. "Virginia, these are very serious accusations. Do you have documentation to support these claims?" "I have comprehensive financial records showing a pattern of fund transfers that appear designed to circumvent regulatory oversight," Virginia replied, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I believe we have a fiduciary responsibility to investigate these irregularities before proceeding with any major strategic decisions." Marcus's mask of charm was beginning to slip. Virginia could see the cold calculation behind his eyes as he processed the threat she represented and began planning his counterattack. But she'd learned from watching him manipulate others, and she was ready for whatever retaliation he might attempt. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about standard corporate accounting practices," Marcus said, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "Virginia is relatively new to executive-level financial oversight, and some of these procedures might seem unusual to someone without extensive experience in corporate finance." It was a classic. Marcus moved, dismissing her concerns by questioning her competence while maintaining plausible deniability about his own actions. But Virginia had prepared for this response by studying his psychological manipulation techniques and developing countermeasures. "You're absolutely right that I'm new to this level of oversight," Virginia said, turning Marcus's condescension into an advantage. "That's exactly why I've been so careful to document everything and verify my understanding with external auditing standards. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious before raising these concerns." The board members exchanged glances. Virginia's humble acknowledgement of her limitations actually made her accusations more credible, not less. She wasn't claiming to be an expert. She was presenting herself as a diligent employee who discovered something troubling and was seeking guidance from more experienced leaders. Marcus realized his mistake too late. By questioning Virginia's competence, he'd walked into her trap and made himself appear defensive and dismissive of legitimate board oversight. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and Virginia was no longer his victim. "I think we should adjourn this meeting and schedule a comprehensive financial review," Robert Hayes announced. "Virginia, please prepare a detailed presentation of your findings for the board's review. Marcus, I'll need your complete cooperation in providing any documentation the board requires." As the meeting ended, Virginia felt a mixture of triumph and terror. She'd successfully challenged Marcus's authority and forced a board investigation, but she'd also declared war against someone who had virtually unlimited resources and absolutely no moral constraints. The real battle was just beginning. The corporate war Virginia had started escalated rapidly. Within 48 hours of the board meeting, she found herself fighting for her life against a psychopath who had no intention of allowing her to destroy everything he'd built. But Virginia had learned from her enemy, and she was no longer the naive woman Marcus thought he could easily manipulate and discard. Marcus's first counterattack came through the legal system. Virginia arrived at work Monday morning to find FBI agents waiting in the lobby, armed with a warrant for her arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. The evidence against her was overwhelming bank records showing large deposits to accounts in her name, forged documents with her signature authorizing illegal transfers, and testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen her participating in the crimes she'd actually been documenting. But Virginia had anticipated this move. Over the weekend, she'd met secretly with Tom Rodriguez and Helen Park, sharing copies of all the evidence she'd gathered and explaining Marcus's pattern of creating false evidence against anyone who threatened him. When the FBI arrived, Virginia's allies were already prepared with their own documentation showing how the evidence against her had been manufactured. "Agent Morrison, before you proceed with this arrest, I think you should review these materials," Tom Rodriguez said, approaching the lead investigator with a thick folder. "They show a systematic pattern of evidence fabrication targeting employees who've discovered illegal activities within this organization." Agent Sarah Morrison, a woman whose sharp intelligence reminded Virginia of Detective Morrison from another case she'd read about, examined the documents with growing interest. She'd been investigating corporate crime for 15 years, and she recognized the hallmarks of sophisticated psychological manipulation when she saw them. "Ms. Rose, these charges against you are certainly serious," Agent Morrison said carefully. "But the allegations your colleagues are presenting suggest a more complex situation than we initially understood. Would you be willing to cooperate with a broader investigation into Sterling Industries' financial practices?" Virginia felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The FBI was offering her protection in exchange for cooperation, but she knew accepting their offer would make her a target for Marcus's most dangerous resources. Corporate psychopaths like Marcus typically had contingency plans for dealing with law enforcement, including corrupt officials, intimidation tactics, and sometimes violence. Marcus himself appeared in the lobby just as Agent Morrison was explaining the plea agreement terms to Virginia. His expression showed none of the panic or anger Virginia had expected. Instead, he looked genuinely concerned and slightly confused, like a caring employer worried about a valued employee who'd apparently been living a double life. "Agent Morrison, I hope there's been some misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice carrying exactly the right mixture of shock and disappointment. "Virginia has been under tremendous stress lately. Her mother recently passed away, and she's been working excessive hours. If she's made some poor decisions, I'm sure we can work together to resolve this situation. It was a masterful performance." Marcus was simultaneously expressing support for Virginia while subtly suggesting she was emotionally unstable and potentially irrational due to grief. He was also positioning himself as the reasonable authority figure willing to help solve the problem, rather than the criminal mastermind who'd created it. But Virginia had learned to recognize Marcus's manipulation techniques, and she could see Agent Morrison was also skilled at reading psychological deception. The FBI agent's expression remained neutral, but Virginia caught the slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she was cataloging inconsistencies in Marcus's story. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your concern for Ms. Rose's well-being," Agent Morrison said politely. "However, the evidence we're reviewing suggests this situation involves systematic corporate fraud rather than individual employee misconduct. We'll need to conduct a comprehensive investigation of Sterling Industries' financial practices and management structure." Marcus's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Virginia to see the cold fury beneath his carefully constructed facade. He was realizing that his attempt to frame Virginia had backfired and exposed him to federal scrutiny he couldn't easily control or manipulate. The investigation that followed would eventually uncover the full scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise. The consulting firm teaching psychological manipulation techniques, the network of shell companies designed to hide stolen funds, the systematic destruction of whistleblowers' careers, and the corruption of officials who should have been protecting employees and investors. But Virginia's victory came at a significant personal cost. The stress of fighting a corporate psychopath while cooperating with federal investigators took a severe toll on her physical and mental health. She lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and struggled with anxiety attacks that left her unable to work for weeks at a time. The trial lasted 18 months. Marcus Sterling was eventually sentenced to 35 years in federal prison for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy charges. 17 other executives from various companies were convicted of participating in his consulting network. Sterling Industries was dissolved, its assets used to compensate the thousands of employees and investors who'd been victimized by Marcus's schemes. Virginia testified as the key government witness, spending days on the witness stand explaining how Marcus had manipulated, trapped, and ultimately underestimated her. The media coverage focused on her transformation from victim to hero, but Virginia knew the real story was more complex. She hadn't defeated Marcus, through superior morality, she'd beaten him by learning to think like a strategic opponent rather than ethical victim. 2 years after the trial ended, Virginia started a non-profit organization dedicated to helping employees recognize and report corporate psychopaths. She'd learned that Marcus Sterling wasn't unique. He was part of a much larger problem of predatory individuals who use their intelligence and charm to exploit others within organizational structures designed to protect them. The most dangerous people in corporate America aren't the obviously evil ones, Virginia told audiences during her speaking engagements. They're the charming, intelligent, successful leaders who seem too perfect to be questioned. They hide in plain sight, using our trust and admiration as weapons against us. Virginia Rose had survived her encounter with a corporate psychopath, but she'd also learned something disturbing about the business world and human nature itself. The people most capable of causing widespread harm were often the ones who seemed most worthy of respect and authority. They walked among us, wearing masks of competence and charisma, while systematically destroying lives for their own profit and entertainment. Subscribe now if you want to learn how to recognize and protect yourself from the corporate psychopaths who might be working in your office right now. Share Virginia's story with someone who needs to understand the warning signs of workplace manipulation. And tell us in the comments, have you ever worked for someone who seemed too charming, too perfect, or too successful to be trusted? Your experiences help others recognize these dangerous patterns before it's too late. Hit that notification bell to stay informed about the hidden predators in corporate America and the brave individuals fighting to expose them.